Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, October 28, 1943. The night is cold and the harbor water lies still under a sky heavy with clouds. At Pier 25, the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, nearly 300 feet long, sits moored against the darkness. The year is 1943. World War II rages across Europe and the Pacific. American ships are being lost to German U-boats at an alarming rate. The Navy is desperate for any advantage, any edge that might turn the tide of battle. On the deck of the Eldridge, Navy officials and a team of scientists move through the shadows, checking equipment, conferring in hushed tones. Something is about to happen here, something the Navy has never officially acknowledged. The machinery hums to life. Copper coils and massive generators, equipment that doesn't belong on a warship, crackle with an unnatural energy. The scientists make their final adjustments. The air grows thick, almost electric. This is not the first time such equipment has been installed on a naval vessel. For months, secret experiments have been conducted in shipyards up and down the East Coast, each one pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible. The scientists are from a unit that doesn't appear in any official Navy directory. Their work is cloaked in the highest classification. Even the admiral commanding this facility doesn't know the full scope of what they're attempting. Then, the greenish fog begins to form. It starts at the waterline, a thick mist that rises slowly, wrapping around the Eldridge's hull like a living thing. The fog creeps across the deck, swirling around the boots of the men standing watch. Some of them step back, uncertain what they're witnessing. Others cannot. They stand frozen, watching the mist climb higher, watching the ship's railings disappear into the grey-green haze. The green deepens, brightening to an unnatural glow, and the hum of the machines rises to a scream. Men cover their ears. The deck vibrates beneath their feet. Something is happening. Something beyond explanation. Then comes the flash. A blinding burst of light. Witnesses will later describe it as a column of pure white fire erupts from the ship. It lasts only a moment. When it fades, when the eyes of the onlookers clear, the USS Eldridge is gone. The pier stands empty. The water where the ship had been is smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The scientists exchange glances. Even they weren't sure what would happen. But this is only half the story, because 20 minutes later, in Norfolk, Virginia, more than 200 miles away, sailors on the deck of another naval vessel look up in disbelief as a ship materializes out of thin air. The USS Eldridge has arrived in Norfolk Harbor, though no one on board can explain how. The fog that enveloped the ship in Philadelphia now dissipates, revealing a vessel that looks aged, weathered by some invisible force. The crew is disoriented. Some are physically ill, vomiting on the deck, barely able to stand. Others have aged visibly in those 20 minutes. Their hair has turned grey. Their faces have lined. One sailor, they say, was found fused to the deck, his body partially embedded in the steel. When they pried him loose, he was barely alive. He would never speak of what he experienced in those 20 minutes. Others vanished entirely, gone. No trace of them ever found. As if they had been left behind in whatever dimension the ship had passed through. As if they had been lost between here and there. What if I told you the US Navy once made a destroyer escort disappear? Not to another dimension, but to another city entirely. What if I told you they teleported a warship and its crew from Philadelphia to Norfolk in the span of 20 minutes, using technology that should not have existed? Would you believe me? Would you dismiss this as science fiction, as the product of an overactive imagination? Or would you pause, just for a moment, and wonder if there might be more to the story?
This is the Philadelphia Experiment, one of World War II's most enduring mysteries. And today, on Unexplained History, we're going to find out what's real and what's fantasy.
For decades, this story has captured the imagination of millions. It has been the subject of books, films, documentaries. It has been debated by historians, dismissed by skeptics, embraced by believers. The Philadelphia Experiment, one of World War II's most enduring mysteries, the stuff of conspiracy theories, sci-fi novels, and late-night internet rabbit holes. It has everything: secret government programs, unknown technology, men who vanished, and questions that have never been answered.
But here's where it gets interesting. In 1969, one man made a confession that should have ended the entire debate. And yet, the story lives on.
In 1969, a man named Carl Allen wrote a letter. Allen was not a sailor, he was not a scientist. He was a UFO researcher, a man who had built a career investigating extraordinary claims, chasing the unexplained across the country. And in that letter, addressed to a friend and fellow researcher, Allen made a confession that would quietly unravel everything the public thought they knew. A confession that would, in time, threaten to collapse the entire edifice of the legend. He wrote, "I made the whole thing up. Those 4 words, that's all it took. The entire legend of the Philadelphia Experiment, the vanished ship, the teleportation, the green fog, the crew who aged or died or returned, may have begun not with a Navy secret, but with the imagination of one man sitting at a typewriter."
So, what's the truth? Was there really a secret Navy experiment that went wrong? Or is this whole story an elaborate hoax? Let's dig in.
To understand how a routine naval procedure became one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century, we need to step back and examine the world as it existed in 1943. We need to understand the context that made such a story possible. The year 1943 was a turning point in World War II. The tide had turned against Germany and Europe, but the war in the Atlantic remained desperate. The waters of the Atlantic were not just treacherous, they were deadly. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes with devastating effectiveness. The wolf packs struck without warning, sinking cargo ships and warships alike. The Allies were losing the battle for the Atlantic. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. The toll was staggering. Cargo vessels, tankers, warships. No ship was safe. The Atlantic Ocean had become a killing ground. But there was another threat lurking beneath the surface, one that didn't require a submarine or a torpedo. The magnetic mine. These mines represented a terrifying innovation in naval warfare. Unlike traditional mines that required a ship to physically strike them, magnetic mines detonated not by contact, but by the mere presence of a steel ship's magnetic field. They could sink a vessel with a single punch, with no warning. The British had first encountered these weapons in 1939, and they had proven devastating. A ship could be destroyed while navigating a channel that had been clear just hours before. There was no defense, no way to predict where the mines might be.
Now, this is where it gets interesting. The Navy had a solution, something called degaussing. And honestly, what happened next sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
The solution was degaussing, a technique developed by the British and refined by the Americans. It involved wrapping a ship's hull with electrical coils that could neutralize its magnetic signature. When the coils were energized, they created a magnetic field that counteracted the ship's natural field. The result was a vessel that was essentially invisible to magnetic mines, a ship that could pass through mined waters without detonating anything. By 1943, degaussing had become standard practice. Every major warship and most merchant vessels underwent the procedure. It was routine, mundane, the kind of maintenance that kept ships alive. But degaussing was also something else, a source of strange phenomena. When the coils were activated, they could produce unusual sounds, low hums, high-pitched squeals, vibrations that could be felt through the deck. More dramatically, they could produce visible effects in the air around the ship. The electromagnetic fields could ionize the atmosphere, creating ghostly glows, shimmering mists, even greenish hues that seemed to cling to the hull. For sailors who didn't understand the technology, these effects could seem mysterious, even supernatural. The ship was producing fog. The ship was producing light. What was happening? Those greenish mists and strange glows would later become the raw material for one of the greatest legends in American history. But that's getting ahead of the story. Now, let's talk about the USS Eldridge itself. The USS Eldridge was a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, commissioned on August 27, 1943. She was named after Sergeant John Ernest Eldridge, a Marine who had earned the Medal of Honor in World War I. The ship was 306 feet long, with a beam of 36 feet. She displaced over 1,300 tons. She carried a crew of around 200 officers and men. She was built to escort convoys, to hunt submarines, to survive. After her commissioning, the Eldridge trained in Bermuda, learning the tactics of anti-submarine warfare. Then she was assigned to duty in the Atlantic, operating out of Norfolk, Virginia. This detail is crucial. The USS Eldridge served from Norfolk, not Philadelphia. She was never based at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. This fact would become central to the debate over whether the experiment ever actually took place. But in 1943, who was paying attention to such details? The legend would place the Eldridge in Philadelphia, in the heart of the shipyard, at the center of a secret experiment, and the legend would grow from there.
Here's the thing. Most historical myths have some basis in reality, and the Philadelphia experiment is no different. The question is, what's the real story behind the legend? Let's find out.
The story goes that on October 28, 1943, scientists at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard activated an experimental electromagnetic field. The purpose, according to the legend, was to make the USS Eldridge invisible to radar, invisible to enemy detection. The project was called, according to various accounts, Project Invisibility or Project Rainbow. It was supposedly a joint venture between the Navy and unknown parties. Some say government scientists, others say extraterrestrial contacts. The technology, as described by those who claimed to have known about it, was based on manipulating electromagnetic fields to bend light around an object. If you could make light bend around a ship, the ship would become invisible. But something went wrong. Something the scientists hadn't anticipated. Instead of just bending light around the ship, the field did something else entirely. It displaced the ship through space, or so the story claims. What happened next defies explanation, at least in conventional terms. The USS Eldridge reportedly vanished from radar. Then, according to witnesses, it disappeared from sight entirely, wrapped in a strange green fog. The fog, according to descriptions, was like nothing the sailors had ever seen before. It seemed to shimmer, to glow, to pulse with an inner light. It moved like a living thing curling around the ship. enveloping it completely. And then, in an instant, the ship was gone. Not sunk, not destroyed, simply absent. The pier where it had been moored stood empty. The water was smooth. The ship had vanished as if it had never been there at all. But that wasn't the end. 20 minutes later, the ship appeared in Norfolk Harbor, more than 200 miles away. The journey that should have taken hours, that should have been impossible, had been completed in minutes. The crew was disoriented, suffering from severe radiation sickness. Some had aged visibly. Their hair had turned white. Their faces had grown lined. They had aged decades in 20 minutes, or so the story goes. Others were physically ill, vomiting, barely able to stand. The experience had traumatized them in ways that would take months to understand. Some would never fully recover. One sailor, according to the story, was found fused to the deck, his body partially embedded in the steel. When they pried him loose, he was barely alive. He would never speak of what he experienced. Others vanished entirely, gone. No trace of them ever found, as if they had been left behind, in whatever dimension the ship had passed through, as if they had been lost between here and there. The legend claims the ship then returned to Philadelphia, completing its journey. The Navy, supposedly, immediately classified all records of the experiment. The crew was scattered to different ships and stations, sworn to silence. Those who tried to talk were threatened. Those who wrote about it had their careers destroyed. The experiment was erased from the official record, buried under layers of classification and denial. This is the story that has been told for decades. It has all the elements of a great mystery: secret experiments, impossible technology, government cover-ups, men who were silenced. It is, in many ways, the perfect conspiracy theory.
But as with all good conspiracy theories, there's a twist. And this one has a pretty big one, because there's a man at the center of this story, and what he eventually admitted might surprise you.
But the legend isn't just about the ship. It's about the people who saw it happen, or claimed they did. And their accounts are some of the most chilling elements of the whole story. One sailor who was stationed on a nearby ship described the moment the Eldridge vanished. He said, "We were watching the ship, and then it was just gone, like someone had erased it. One moment it was there, the next, nothing." Another witness, a dock worker who was on the pier that night, gave an even more disturbing account. He claimed the ship didn't disappear all at once. It faded, like an image slowly dissolving in water. First the bow became translucent, then the middle, then the stern. The whole thing just went ghost, he would later say. You could see through it. You could see the lights on the other side of the pier right through the ship's hull. Perhaps the most disturbing account comes from crew members who claim to have been aboard the Eldridge during the experiment. One sailor later described the sensation of the deck beneath his feet, turning strange, almost rubbery. It felt like the floor was breathing, he claimed, like the steel had turned to something else, something soft. I couldn't keep my balance. Everything was moving around me, but I wasn't moving at all. Then there were the accounts of crew members who reportedly phased in and out of existence. They would become visible, then invisible, then visible again, caught somewhere between this world and whatever world the ship had passed through. One witness described seeing his own hand become transparent. I could see right through my palm. I could see the deck on the other side. I could see the water below. And then, just like that, it was solid again. These are the accounts that fuel the legend. Not just a ship that vanished, but men who were torn between two states of existence, between here and somewhere else, between the living and something else entirely. And then there was the matter of the fused sailor, the man who was found embedded in the deck of the ship when it reappeared in Norfolk. According to witnesses, his body had somehow become part of the ship itself. You could see his outline in the steel, one sailor claimed. His shape was there, like a fossil in rock. They had to cut the deck apart to get him out. He was barely breathing. His eyes were open, but he didn't recognize anyone. The sailor, according to the story, never fully recovered. He would spend the rest of his life in and out of hospitals, suffering from what doctors called an unknown neurological condition. He never spoke about what he experienced in those 20 minutes. These accounts, the fading ship, the rubber deck, the phasing crew, the fused sailor, these are the details that make the Philadelphia experiment so compelling. They transform a simple story into something visceral, something that haunts you.
But here's what we need to remember. These are stories, reported by people decades after the event, with no way to verify what really happened. And as we'll see, the man who started telling these stories had a very specific reason to make them as dramatic as possible.
Enter Carl M. Allen, also known as Carlos Allende, the merchant mariner who first told this story in 1955. Allen was not a Navy officer. He was not a scientist. He was a civilian, a merchant mariner with a fascination for the unexplained. Allen claimed to have been aboard the USS Eldridge during the experiment. He claimed to have witnessed the green fog, the flash of light, the teleportation to Norfolk. He claimed to have lived through something impossible. Beginning in 1955, Allen began bombarding UFO researcher Morris K. Jessup with handwritten letters, dozens of them, hundreds, each one expanding on the story, adding new details, new witnesses, new evidence, or so it seemed. The letters were cryptic, often barely coherent. They spoke of secret experiments, of technology beyond comprehension, of a Navy program that had gone wrong. They were the raw material from which the legend would be built. But there were problems with Allen's story from the beginning. The investigation reveals timeline problems. Allen wasn't even in Philadelphia in 1943. Naval records show he was serving on other vessels, nowhere near the Eldridge. Allen claimed to have been a crew member on the Eldridge during the experiment, but his service records tell a different story. He was on other ships, in other ports, during the time in question.
So right away, we have a problem. The main witness wasn't even where he claimed to be. But it gets worse.
This discrepancy should have been enough to dismiss the story. But the legend had already taken root. People wanted to believe, and so they found ways to explain away the inconsistencies. Then comes the bombshell. In 1969, Allen confessed to fabricating the entire story. He admitted to making up the details, perhaps to gain attention, perhaps to perpetuate a hoax, perhaps for reasons he never fully explained. The confession was quiet, almost overlooked. It came in a letter, much like the original claims had come in letters, and it should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Part of the answer lies in the nature of confessions themselves. When someone confesses to a hoax, there's always a suspicion that they're being pressured, that they're denying the truth to protect someone, that the real story is too dangerous to tell. Allen had confessed, but to what? The letter was vague, the details were unclear, and his later statements only added to the confusion. Some say he recanted the confession. Others say he stuck to it until the end. The Navy's official records also tell a different story. The USS Eldridge was never in Philadelphia during October 1943. It was in Norfolk, undergoing training and degaussing procedures, which, to those who didn't understand the technology, might have seemed like something more mysterious. The degaussing tests were routine. The greenish hue sometimes seen around ships during the process was a known phenomenon. The strange sounds, the vibrations, the atmospheric effects, all had explanations. But in the hands of someone with a vivid imagination, these ordinary events became the stuff of legend. The ship that disappeared became the ship that teleported. The routine test became the secret experiment. What started as misinterpretation of routine technology evolved into something much larger. The tale picked up details, acquired witnesses, grew into a story that seemed too big to be made up.
So, where does this leave us? We have a story that started with a man who wasn't even there, who later admitted he made it up, about a ship that wasn't even in the right port. That's a lot of problems. But the story still won't die. Why?
But the Philadelphia experiment didn't die with Allen's confession. In fact, something strange happened that would take the story to an entirely new level. Something that would transform it from a fringe conspiracy theory into a cultural phenomenon. In 1957, something remarkable arrived in Morris Jessup's office. A copy of his own book, a book about UFO investigations, had been returned to him. But this was no ordinary book. The book was covered in handwritten annotations. Not just any annotations, strange technical notes in the margins that discuss things the public shouldn't have known. Things about alien technology, things about secret experiments, things about the Philadelphia experiment. The annotations were written in 3 distinct handwriting styles. Some were critical, some were explanatory. Some seemed to be from someone who claimed to have direct knowledge of the events being discussed. Someone who knew far more than they should. The book became known as the Annotated Jessup, and it would become one of the most mysterious artifacts in the entire history of the Philadelphia experiment legend. The Office of Naval Research, the ONR, reportedly ordered 127 copies of the annotated book for study. That's right. The US Navy was supposedly interested in this weird little book, with its strange marginalia. The annotations referenced technical details that weren't publicly known. They discussed electromagnetic technology, alien spacecraft, and, yes, the Philadelphia experiment. It was as if someone was trying to confirm the very story Carl Allen had told.
Now, this is where it gets really weird, because the annotations raised a question that has never been answered. Who wrote them? And more importantly, were they real?
Some researchers believe the annotations came from Carl Allen himself, an attempt to lend credibility to his story by appearing to confirm it in Jessup's own book. Others suggested they came from someone inside the Navy, someone who wanted the story to spread. The most outlandish theory claimed the annotations came from an extraterrestrial source, beings who had provided the technology for the original experiment and were now reaching out through this strange medium. Whatever the source, the Annotated Jessup became a key piece of evidence for believers. Here was a mysterious document, apparently studied by the Navy, filled with technical details that seemed to confirm the impossible. And it was this strange artifact, along with Carl Allen's original letters, that would catch the attention of 2 writers who would take the Philadelphia experiment mainstream. But that's a story for the next segment, because by the late 1970s, the legend was about to explode. Before we get to how the story went mainstream, let's take a moment to ask, is any of this actually possible? Could you really make a ship disappear using electromagnetic fields? The idea behind the legend is based on real science, or at least science that was being explored during World War II. The concept is called electromagnetic camouflage, and it was a real area of research. The basic idea is simple in principle. If you can bend light around an object, you can make it invisible. The object would appear to not be there because no light bouncing off it would reach the viewer's eye. In the 1940s, researchers were indeed exploring ways to reduce a ship's radar signature, the beginnings of what would become known as stealth technology. But radar invisibility is very different from optical invisibility.
Here's the thing. Making something invisible to radar is one thing. Making it disappear entirely to teleport is something else entirely. And the physics just don't support it.
Some researchers have tried to link the Philadelphia experiment to the work of Nikola Tesla. Tesla claimed to be working on a death ray and later talked about weapons based on directed energy. Some conspiracy theories suggest he went further. There's also a persistent rumor that Einstein worked on something called the unified field theory, a way to combine gravity, electromagnetism, and the other forces of the universe. Some suggest this research was secret, and that the Philadelphia experiment was an attempt to harness these forces. But here's the bottom line. There is no scientific evidence that any of this is possible. Teleporting a 300-ton warship would require energy levels that exceed anything humanity has ever produced. The quantum mechanical concept of teleportation that physicists sometimes discuss involves moving quantum states, not physical objects. And even that requires a tremendous amount of infrastructure and processing. As for making an object invisible to the naked eye using electromagnetic fields, that remains science fiction. Some limited experiments have been done with so-called metamaterials that can bend light around small objects, but this technology is nowhere near capable of hiding a ship. So the science, as far as we understand it, says the Philadelphia experiment is impossible. That doesn't mean the story isn't compelling. It absolutely is. But the technology described in the legend simply doesn't exist.
That said, there's a reason these kinds of stories persist. And it's not just about the science. It's about the context, the era, the fears, the real experiments that were happening around the same time.
The Philadelphia experiment doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a larger landscape of strange military experiments, some real, some imagined, that emerged from World War II and the Cold War. Project Rainbow is one name often linked to the Philadelphia experiment. Officially, this was a real Navy program aimed at reducing the radar signature of ships. It was the ancestor of modern stealth technology. But in the world of conspiracy theories, Project Rainbow became something more, a catch-all name for any secret experiment involving invisibility, teleportation, or impossible technology. If the Navy was doing something strange, it was often attributed to Project Rainbow. Then there's Operation Crossroads, the nuclear tests conducted at Bikini Atoll in 1946. These tests involved placing ships in the blast zone and observing the effects of nuclear explosions on naval vessels. The images from these tests are haunting. Ships being lifted out of the water, twisted into unrecognizable shapes, vaporized in the blink of an eye. They seem to confirm that the military was willing to push the boundaries of what was possible, even if it meant destroying their own equipment. For conspiracy theorists, Operation Crossroads was proof that the military was conducting experiments that defied normal understanding. If they were willing to irradiate ships, what else might they be willing to do? Then there's HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. This is a real research program that studies the ionosphere. But conspiracy theories have imagined it as a weapon capable of controlling weather, mind control, or even creating portals to other dimensions.
Here's the pattern. Real military research creates the seed of a conspiracy. Then, the imagination does the rest. People hear about a legitimate program and fill in the gaps with their own fears and fascinations.
The Philadelphia experiment fits perfectly into this pattern. There's just enough real science, degaussing, radar, electromagnetism to make the story plausible, and then the rest is pure imagination. The real experiments were fascinating enough. They saved lives, advanced technology, and changed the nature of warfare. But they weren't magic. They weren't impossible. They were just science. The real kind, not the conspiracy kind. Three competing explanations battle for credibility. Let's look at what each side has to offer. First, the complete hoax theory. This is the view that Carl Allen was an attention seeker who invented the tale, and that his 1969 confession proves it. According to this view, Allen fabricated the entire story, perhaps to insert himself into the UFO research community. Perhaps simply for the attention. The legend grew in the telling, fed by others who added their own embellishments. The evidence for this theory is substantial. Allen wasn't on the Eldridge. He confessed to fabrication. The ship was never in Philadelphia. The Navy has no record of any such experiment. The whole story falls apart under scrutiny. But believers counter that Allen was silenced, pressured, or manipulated, that his confession was not genuine, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that the Navy would say nothing, confirm nothing, deny everything. Second, the degaussing misunderstanding theory. This is the view that routine degaussing tests were misinterpreted by sailors who didn't understand the technology. The green fog, the strange sounds, the vibrations, these were all normal side effects of the degaussing process. Ships really did produce eerie effects when the coils were activated. The technology was real, just not as dramatic as the legend suggests. Over time, these ordinary phenomena were transformed in memory into something extraordinary. The ship's actual movements, routine transfers between naval bases, became a tale of teleportation. A mundane event became a miracle. This theory explains the origins of the story without invoking deliberate deception. People saw something strange, didn't understand it, and imagined explanations that were more dramatic than reality. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the story focused specifically on the Eldridge. It doesn't explain Carl Allen's detailed claims. And it doesn't explain why the legend took on such a specific form. Third, the government cover-up theory. This is the view that classified experiments did occur, and that the Navy's denial and erased records prove it. Supporters argue that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Navy would deny everything, of course. That's what governments do. The erased records, the silenced witnesses, the classified documents all point to a conspiracy of silence. They point to the Navy's refusal to comment, to the scattered records, to the stories of crew members who were supposedly silenced. In this view, the Philadelphia experiment was real. It just was never acknowledged. But this theory has a problem. It assumes that something must be true because it hasn't been disproven. It treats the lack of evidence as evidence, and it ignores the positive evidence that the story was fabricated.
Here's my take. The first two explanations make the most sense. Either Alan made it up, or people misinterpreted routine technology. But there's a reason this story took off, and it has less to do with the facts than you might think.
Let's hear what the experts have to say, because over the decades, a number of historians and engineers have taken a hard look at the Philadelphia experiment, and their conclusions are not kind to the legend. Naval historians have examined the deck logs of the USS Eldridge. Those logs show the ship was hundreds of miles away from Philadelphia on the night of October 28, 1943. It was in Norfolk, participating in training exercises. These records are official documents, signed and dated. They represent the day-to-day operations of a naval vessel, and they directly contradict the core claim of the legend. As one historian put it, the deck logs don't lie. The Eldridge was not in Philadelphia. It could not have been part of an experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The story is physically impossible. Engineers have also weighed in on the physics, and their assessments are equally devastating to the legend. Teleporting a 300-euro-ton warship would require energy levels beyond anything humanity has produced, one engineer explained. We're not talking about a small amount of power. We're talking about something on the scale of a nuclear reaction. And even if you had that kind of energy, he continued, there's no theory, no known physics that would allow you to direct it in the way the story describes. This is science fiction. It's not even good science fiction. The skeptics also point to the pattern of the story itself. The claims are exactly what you'd expect from a hoax. Extraordinary technology, government cover-ups, silenced witnesses, evidence that mysteriously doesn't exist. These are the hallmarks of conspiracy theories everywhere. They're almost formulaic in their construction, and that uniformity is itself evidence that something is wrong.
So, the experts are skeptical. The evidence doesn't support the story. The science doesn't support it. Even the basic facts don't support it. And yet, the legend persists. Why? Let's talk about that.
The legend's second life came in 1979, when Charles Berlitz and William Moore published their bestseller, The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility. The book brought the story to mainstream audiences, transforming it from a fringe conspiracy theory into a cultural phenomenon. Berlitz was already famous for writing about the Bermuda Triangle. He had a talent for taking vague stories and turning them into dramatic narratives. Moore was a journalist who had been investigating UFO stories for years. Together, they crafted a book that read like a thriller. They presented the story as established fact, ignoring the contradictions, dismissing the skeptics, building a case for a secret government experiment that had been covered up for decades. The book added new details, new witnesses, new evidence, or at least new claims. It introduced the world to the story of Carl Allen, to the tale of the green fog and the teleportation. It cemented the legend in the public imagination. The timing was perfect. The late 1970s were a time of renewed interest in conspiracies, in government secrets, in the idea that there was more to history than met the eye. The Watergate scandal had shaken faith in government. The Cold War had created an appetite for stories about secret weapons. The Philadelphia experiment fit perfectly into this cultural moment. It was a story about government secrecy, about technology that was being hidden, about the truth being suppressed. It satisfied the growing suspicion that something was being kept from the American people. Film, television, and novels have all explored the story, each adding new layers of embellishment. The 1994 film The Philadelphia Experiment brought it to an even wider audience, cementing it in popular culture. The movie took liberties with the story, of course, adding elements that had never been part of the original claim. But that's how legends work. Each retelling adds new details. Each adaptation makes the story more dramatic. But the internet took the legend to a new level. Suddenly, anyone could share the story, add their own theories, connect it to other conspiracies. The Philadelphia Experiment found its natural home in the digital age. Reddit threads discuss the finer points. YouTube documentaries present new evidence. TikTok creators make short, punchy videos about the green fog and the fused sailor. The story has become content, endlessly remixable, endlessly debatable. Some UFO researchers have gone further, claiming the technology came from extraterrestrial sources. Others connect it to the Montauk Project, a supposed series of secret experiments in time manipulation that also emerged from the conspiracy theory community. These connections don't need to be true. They don't even need to make sense. They just need to be compelling. And the Philadelphia Experiment has proven endlessly compelling.
But here's what I keep coming back to. The Eldridge itself had a real history. It was a real ship with a real crew doing real things during the war. And that real history is actually pretty interesting.
The USS Eldridge served with distinction throughout World War II. It completed 9 convoy escort missions to the Mediterranean, carrying personnel and materials to support Allied operations in North Africa and Southern Europe. The ship was decommissioned on June 17, 1946, and transferred to Greece on January 15, 1951, where it served as the Leon until 1999. That's a real legacy. That's a real story. But that's not the story people want to hear. They want the secret experiment. They want the teleportation. They want the men who aged decades in 20 minutes. Because that story is more exciting, more mysterious, more worth talking about. And so, the legend continues, fed by our desire for the extraordinary, our suspicion of government, our need to believe that there's more to the world than meets the eye.
Let's bring it home. What do we actually know? And what should we take away from all this?
What do we actually know? What can we verify? What is the evidence actually telling us? The USS Eldridge existed. It served in World War II. It was decommissioned in 1946 and transferred to Greece. That's a fact, documented, verifiable, uncontroversial. Carl Allen sent the letters, made the claims, and then confessed to fabrication. That's also a fact. He may have later recanted, but the confession exists. The evidence that he was not on the Eldridge is overwhelming. The Navy has no record of any invisibility experiment, No documents have ever been declassified that confirm the story. No credible witness has ever come forward with independent verification. And yet the story persists. The legend has evolved, captured the public imagination, and become a part of popular culture. It has been featured in films, books, and documentaries. It has been discussed on countless radio shows and podcasts. Maybe it's because we're living in an age of distrust. We don't trust our governments, our institutions, our leaders. We suspect that they're hiding things from us. And stories like the Philadelphia experiment confirm our suspicions. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we just like a good story. The Philadelphia experiment has drama, it has mystery, it has everything we want in a tale: secret experiments, government cover-ups, men who vanished. Think about that pier in Philadelphia, the cold October night, the green fog rising from the waterline, the moment the ship vanishes into nothing. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but here's what we know for certain. Somewhere, right now, someone is telling the story to someone else, and they're believing every word.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the Philadelphia experiment. We hope we gave you something to think about, whether you believe the legend or not. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe and drop a review. It really helps the show. Next time, another journey into the unexplained. See you then.